So I see it's now 2 minutes after the hour. We have 24 people signed up at the moment, or who are logged in at the moment. Might be a good time for us to get started so that we can really make good use of our time. And Stuart and I have really been delighted when I was talking with Alex, the other Alex at nRhythm, not the Alex who was just speaking, and with Trey Cates, who's also there, that they might offer some of their knowledge and their webinar trainings to our community. And they very generously said, yes, of course, we are doing this work committed to cooperation. So we want to step in and help. And so here we are today. And the idea behind this webinar is that at a deeper level, the Regenerative Communities Network is really just a peer-to-peer learning network. It has a website and it has people who know each other. But if we're not learning together, then we're really not functioning like a network the way that we need to. So from the beginning, this has been a major part of what John Fullerton and Stuart Cowan had envisioned for the network. So to offer webinars like this and other regular educational opportunities for us to teach each other is exactly what we want to see happening. So thank you to Alex and to Trey for role modeling that for us today. And Stuart, is there anything else you'd like to say before we get started?
Neil, welcome everybody. Glad you're here.
Beautifully succinct. And Stuart and I are going to be here as participants. So we'll not be facilitating except to just help in back channels if anyone needs us. But otherwise, it'll be Trey and Alex who are leading the show for the next hour and a half. So we hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's a pleasure to, one, both be a part of the network as well as being a resource in the network. And I do want to, as Joe pointed out, highlight Alex. In the event that there are questions as a part of this, she's my colleague here. We're kind of, she's facilitating, I'm presenting. And so if there are questions along the way, if you're struggling to make this webinar work, both in terms of you being able to hear or talk, you can message and she'll respond to you in the chat function. And then she will also, somewhere down the line, we'll use this time to have some breakout groups, which is the wonderful opportunity we have with some technology. And so she will be helping us with that when we get to that point too. So we have some time today to be able to dive into this idea of how we increase the energy within a network, or as we know, within the relationships or the dependent relationships within the network. And so a little bit about my background. For some of you, you may be aware of this. I was one of the founding members of the Savory Network. And so that was a part of the Savory Institute's goal to be able to create a global network of both practitioners and educators it's right now currently 6 continents. And that began as a real core strategy as a part of the Savory Institute in 2012. And so wonderfully, this work that I'll be talking to you about today has actually emerged out of a lot of that on the ground process of working through what does it look like to continue to nurture a healthy network. So excited about that. But with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a presentation. Alex is recording this, and you will have the opportunity to have the presentation as well. So feel free to take the notes that you want to take, but recognize that you will get the opportunity to utilize this or have access to this at a later time shortly. So with that being said, I'm sharing my screen now, and we will go from there. So a couple of nods on sharing of my screen would be great. All right, we got the nods, and we'll jump into it. So in terms of expectations today, well, first of all, let me just say that to me, this whole idea of regeneration is a journey. And everything that we're doing is, as is the case in any living system, continuing to be open to the possibilities and then being able to adapt to what's going on around us as things emerge, as is the case in every complex system. And so, I always begin with a slide like this because to me, this is what it's about. We're all working it out together. And to me, that's the most powerful thing that we can be committed to. When we talk about expectations today, we're going to hit it from 3 different angles. I really want to ground us in this life-centered approach, which is based on living systems, talk about what regenerative health looks like, and then talk about what it looks like to design, to energize both the individual as well as members within a network or an organization. And so that gives you the high point. For me, instead of just jumping straight into energy flows, I felt like it would be great for us, and we have a little bit of time to build off of, some foundations. So when we talk about living systems approach, we actually really ground it in some pretty amazing emerging science. Some of you may be familiar with this book, The Systems View of Life, and all the research around that. It's actually one of the few, if not kind of one of the leading researchers and scientists that are actually approaching biology through this holistic or systems lens. And we feel like, in light of all the anecdotal evidence that exists about why we should take this regenerative approach, what's starting to emerge out of this research is some pretty fascinating things that really begins to create even more credibility around the approaches that are starting to show up in this regenerative paradigm. So with this, a couple of interesting things came out of their research. The first was this, the thing that they did is they examined and mapped all the different chemical, material, energetic pathways in the simplest form of life, which is bacteria. And then in doing so, there are some interesting things that came out of that. And we won't spend time diving deeply into it all, but enough to be able to give us some foundation to where we're going and what we believe is a part of this regenerative approach. And what they found was everything needed to maintain pathways generated by a cell was within the cell wall, which it also makes, which is a very strong, interesting point in terms of life. And that the defining aspect of life is its ability to self-maintain and self-regenerate. And I love that they coined this term autopoiesis, self-poetry, self-making. And so when we think about this idea of regeneration or a regenerative network, I really want you to have in your mind this idea of self-poetry, self-making. It is what we make it to be, versus that it has some kind of being outside of us as living beings. So with that idea in mind, one of the things that they began to postulate was life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. And to me, that's one of the most powerful aspects coming out of this living systems research, which is living is equal to regenerative, and regenerative is equal to living. And so, but it's all tied about this boundary that is created by life and maintained by life versus it being and having some kind of life outside of life. And so with that, we then talk about, so when we looked and they saw that research and they started diving into the cell and that bacteria, they asked the question, so where is life? So a couple of things came out of that. The first one was self-regeneration or self-regenerative ability is not located in any one place. So it goes back to that command and control idea. It doesn't exist. There isn't some place where it is controlled and maintained, and when you address that, then life doesn't exist. Actually, life is a part of it and all aspects of the cell within that boundary of its own making. It also found that the research created or communicated that it was dependent on interconnected relationships of all aspects of the cell. So life didn't exist without the connections, which to me, again, is powerful when we talk about networks. The other thing, which to me is fascinating, is life is a holistic, emergent property of the cell and all the connected relationships. So it doesn't exist without those connections. Life can't exist without it. And then, I know we shouldn't use this word in this context, but I'm using it to prove a point, which is each part of this self-regenerative system, this autopoietic, this boundary of its own making, are all self-regenerative. So holes within holes. So the ability for life to exist exists in all kinds of complexity, but something that is powerful about all this is we recognize it's not in one place. It's dependent upon the relationships. Life is an emergent part of all of that, and that all aspects of that system is holes within holes, or they're all self-regenerative holes. Now, to me, there's so much importance that comes out of this work to inform how we, in our social systems, design ourselves. But before we jump into that, I want to ask, so what is death? And they asked that same question. So death, or lack of life in this aspect, is ending the ability to be self-regenerative, one, and it involves the lack of interconnected relationships. So if it can't self-regenerate and it's not connected, there is no life. That's actually death. And if we then immediately take application to our organizations or our economies or our networks, man, there's some incredible relevance to all of that. It's inability to be self-regenerative and the lack of connectedness, or as we know it to be silos, is actually what is making it so difficult for us to create life, because life is actually not there. So what is it that we need to do to create the conditions for life to emerge by us continuing to nurture that self-regeneration in addition to the connectedness that we know to exist within these social and biological systems? So when we think about this practically, think about the human body. So on the left, you see the aspect of this is what interconnected is. This is what life is. And when those interconnections, dependencies don't exist, in essence, this is death. And we all know we have the technology to allow a heart to live in a silo, right? We can make it live, but it needs substantial inputs to be able to maintain that life, right? And I can use examples like conventional agriculture. We know what it looks like to be able to create incredible productivity and efficiency in agriculture at the expense of the underlying soil. But when you take those inputs out, those fertilizers, those herbicides, those insecticides, there is no life in the soil, right? And so what we're talking about here is recognizing that where that interconnectedness exists, we do have life. Now then think of it in terms of how our organizations are designed, or our networks, our economies. I could fill in all these circles with different words that would give you a sense of how we operate. But we tend to operate substantially in silos. And any biological system, that's death. And I will make the case today that that same biological system applies to us because we are biology. in the context of how we interact and engage, and that is a social, in our social context. And this is the beginning of energy flow in all organizations and networks. And if we can't create those connections, it is impossible. And I'm strongly saying this, it's impossible for us to create the conditions for life. So this is what Capra said in saying this, is there is no environment in some independent or abstract sense. Just as there is no organization too, without an environment, there is no environment without an organism. Organisms not only experience environments, they also create them. And it just comes back to why we all exist today as a network. This Regenerative Communities Network exists because we want it to exist. It is a boundary of our own making. And now it's about us creating the connections so that we can have the opportunity to create even more life as a part of it. So living systems are dependent upon their environment and also create their environment. So in summary of kind of our basis for why we approach it this way, one, life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. Living is regenerative, regenerative is living. Life is an emergent property of all these interdependent relationships, and life creates the conditions necessary for life. Now, some incredible things come from these conclusions. One is this enormous amount of opportunity that comes when we see that and come together. The second is the responsibility that we have, that to create the conditions for life, we've got to be interconnected. We've got to continue to build more dependencies and relationships with one another to be able to enable life to exist. Otherwise, death exists in the absence of that interconnection. And so when we think about that, there are so many things that start to emerge in our mind about how we organize our interactions with one another, how we organize the economies that we're a part of, the collaborations that we're a part of. And that starts to give us insights into why we believe this definition of a regenerative network, this working definition, there's nothing sacred about this definition, but it's something that gives us meaning, which is we see it as a living, evolving, naturally functioning environment where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. When you think of healthy systems, you're not worried about the productivity and the efficiencies. It comes as a part of its underlying health. And when it's healthy, it begins to behave in a very, very different way than when it's not. And all of the living systems that we began, and many of you know far more than me when it comes to the systems that we're talking about from a biological, ecological, or even human systems perspective. But what we recognize is if we know it's living, we know that it's continuing to adapt and change and evolve, and that it should be functioning in a natural state, then that abundance and resilience that we all want across the globe in all of our communities comes as a result of that health. And that recurring outcome can be relied upon and actually seen over and over and over again. And so we use that as a working way of which we say this, treating life like this, approaching life like this is the beginning of energy flow. It's the beginning of how we began to bring this kind of work into our relationships so that we design it differently. And why do we design it differently? Because we are wanting to create the outcomes that we all desire to create, but we've got to be intentional about recognizing how powerful that could be. So when we talk about the context of the Regenerative Communities Network, we believe that the network's context, the boundary of its own making, is important to get clear. So why do we exist as a network? Can we unite around our existence or purpose? Can we create an environment that allows everyone to thrive? To me, all of that begins to be something that we collectively get to design, we collectively get to discuss, and we collectively begin to work it out in that interdependency of the relationships that exist. We cannot work it out in silos. Working it out in silos does not create the opportunities that we want to create. It is totally about co-creation. And so what that looks like for us is we see networks really getting clear about its design purpose. And then as a part of that design purpose, or what I call the collective why, we also recognize and embrace this idea of our network roles and what's the quality of life that we want to create with one another while we do this, and how are we going to behave in that interconnectedness, that dependency. And in doing that, we set the conditions both for impacting our supporting environment, not just impacting, creating it, as well as that environment influencing us. And so we actually get to enable the world that we want by establishing this boundary of our own making as a means to be able to engage in these relationships. And so our intention would be that we as a network would define this and make it clear what that is and help people understand their role as a part of that process. And so if you're thinking about this as a network member, I would imagine you'd say, so now what role can I play that can enable this incredible purpose, our collective why? And that begins to be a very different kind of conversation versus us. Typically, we all have done this, engaging in such a way where we're trying to engage transactionally about what we're going to get out of it. It's a big difference, isn't it? Everybody nods, say, yeah, it's a big difference, right? Because our going into something about what we're going to get out is very different than going in, bringing that role, occupying that role within the network as a means to be able to give into it so that we can then begin to benefit from it. So we see network context is the beginning of this energy flow, because we can't, until we establish that boundary of our own making, it's important that that boundary is what then begins to give us the opportunity to create life. Without it, just like it was without the cell wall, life doesn't exist. So here we get to create that for our context. And to understand, which I truly embrace, that sometimes the boundary of our own making is a very informal process that happens because life exists when we decide to create that interconnectedness between ourselves. So that is something that can happen in a natural way. So in addition to that is this idea of network health. When we talk about what is living, and regenerative is living and living is regenerative, we really, nRhythm takes this, in deep-seated belief that we need to manage the health of a given network or an organization or a landscape. And in doing so, we create the conditions for regeneration. So we believe that a network is a living environment that flourishes when the health of its members and its connections are thriving. So I throw this up here to say, in most people and most organizations, and I would even say in most networks, most people are not thriving. We need to embrace the fact that 70% in most organizations are disengaged. And it's created an enormous amount of challenges from an economic standpoint, but even more though, from a well-being standpoint. When you begin to occupy a role or to operate in a way where things are transactional versus regenerative and relational, it does not create outcomes that are good for life. It may create outcomes that are good for an industrialized system, but it's not good for life. And so this right here, this slide, gives you a sense of what are the unintended consequences of treating life like a machine. This is what I think happens. And so when we think about all the language and all of the imagery that we've seen over the last good 50, 60, 70 years. It's about seeing life as a machine. And throw this up here as just an example of that, right? I mean, can you imagine that we would then treat our human body as though it's pulleys and levers and pumps? This image is how we've approached most of our social systems, including our own personal biological system, the human body. And that's not how complex systems need to be treated, nor that's how they work. And then it's been applied to economies, right? So you can see your business is a machine. Here we've got a slide of the state of Georgia in the United States as an economic engine. So when we begin to see that the opposite of treating life as regenerative in life, it's a boundary of its own making, is no, it's not life. It's a combination and a collection of gears and pulleys. And in that context, life is seen very differently, right? But what I want you to know is that when we think about life, we're all challenged with what that looks like. And so here in this slide here, some of you are familiar with the Savory Institute. I mentioned it earlier. This is from them. And, you know, this is bare ground. When you look at bare ground, people go, gosh, it can't be productive. It can't be at all efficient in its way to be able to deliver this solid, healthy ecosystem process. And there's some real insight into how do we approach a complex system as a part of that. But what's interesting is maybe it has nothing to do with inputs. Maybe it has nothing to do with the things that tend to drive us to solve things. Maybe it's just working with nature, working with the ecosystem to be able to create the outcomes. And so when we get a situation where we're talking about looking at this as bare ground, imagine this is just an individual or an organization where when we see it or we look at it or we feel it, we just feel like, man, what can come out of that? But it just begins with this intention. And so with a change of management, with a change of design, maybe, just maybe what we get out of that is real change in regeneration and what happens as a part of that underlying ecosystem process. And so what bare ground represents is just unrealized potential. That's all that it represents, unrealized potential. And so with unrealized potential, if we can change our design and change our management, what's been dormant can then actually come alive. And it really begins to be something that becomes something so meaningful as a part of a process that we can recognize that real diversity can come out of that. Real connectedness comes out of that when we're working with versus against the complexity, working with life versus against it. And this is actually in the Chihuahua Desert in Mexico. And so just the idea, if we see that, we see so much, if we're looking through the eyes of regeneration, unrealized potential. And what we want to experience, what we want to have is this idea of complete regeneration as a part of this process. And regeneration representative of us continuing to nurture the conditions of life. And that I'm committed to. That I know this network is committed to. And now it's a matter of us designing it in such a way where we create those outcomes. But what we don't want is this, right? So now, Matt, how many of you want to see this as a part of how we see ourselves as members of an ecosystem that can thrive versus cogs as a part of a wheel, right? And I don't think we were ever meant to be designed this way. But that's how our economies are designed. That's how our organizations are designed. And unfortunately, that's how our transactions and interactions with one another are designed. And when we see life this way, all we do is focus on, well, we can replace that one life with another life when that life is worn down and is proven to be no longer meaningful. And to me, that's not what we do with life. We nurture the conditions for life to emerge. So the last aspect of this is this idea of energy flow, which is all coming through this foundation. It's all coming through our approach. It's all coming through our design. But this deep interdependent relationships come because we're committed to the members of a part of that boundary of its own making. And I don't think we can create the opportunities around regeneration without a commitment to this deeper interconnectedness for members to thrive in a network, in an organization, and in a community. And so we take this approach where we see energy flow within an organization or a network as thriving people. And on the left-hand side, what you see is we really try to create the conditions for someone's uniqueness to come alive, their genius as such. We also really want to make sure we focus on the well-being of that member, and that then in the context of this boundary of its own making, the role or the work that they get to be a part of. And so today, of course, we're not going to get a chance to be able to go into all this. But what we're going to talk about is that row one around genius or uniqueness. And it's tied even back to that uniqueness that we come together as a network, which is what's our purpose, what's our passion, and we're going to talk about place. And we're going to spend time on that. But we also want to recognize that as a part of that, we bring our whole self, which means our mind, we need to continue to recognize the constructs and the beliefs that we have, and our physical body and what that means to be able to give us energy in the work that we do, and those social spiritual connections that we're talking about today. In addition to this role that work plays in what we do, that it's designed around your genius. It's not designed around a job description or some kind of somebody sitting in an upper office to tell you what it leaks. If we can design around genius, it changes. And if we can create healthy conditions, and then we can see our relationships as a viable, valuable exchange and contribution, I mean, that is how we can design to create energy in organizations. But today we're just going to talk about genius as a part of this process. So let's start with Einstein. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid, right? So one of the challenges that I think I've found in the work that we've been doing globally is that we just treat everybody like they're a fish, right? And not everybody's a fish, and not everybody it has the ability to do the things that's representative, that we expect, that's interchangeable from one organization to the next, and from one network to the next. The question is you people who are here today create a unique opportunity to look very different than if it was a totally different group of 25 people. So then that means, if that's true, if that underlying philosophy is true, then what that means is we design around the people that are here, because you are what's creating life. You are what's creating the energy. It is not some kind of intellectual or conceptual process. It's actual biology working. When we're creating that, we then get to engage in that and make it what we want it to be. And there life emerges. And so we don't want to treat people like a fish. We don't want to treat people as though they're meant to be in one context and that's not working for them. Let's design around the people that are here as a means to be able to create the outcomes that we all believe is beneficial to this world that we are trying to impact and change. And with that being the case, what we believe happens when you design around this person's unique genius, right? We see potential realized, revealing potential through this regenerative design is unleashing an individual's genius is core to revealing that potential. And as a result of that, we also recognize, or actually is a precursor to that, that we need to come from a place of health, which means that when people begin to recognize what that unique genius is, it also sets the conditions, right, for them to focus on what allows for that to emerge in their own life. I can tell you from having done this work now for a while, unique genius is not just your skills. It isn't just your experience, right? It is those things that we've been talking about. It's this genius that's seen inside of you. It's the purpose that's wrapped around that, and in addition to how you bring all of that to play in the workplace, in your relationships, in your families. And that allows us to approach it very differently. So with that in mind, one of the things I want to show you guys is something that I think will give you a little bit of a insight into how this may play itself out with just a very different context, a little music, a little imagery, and a lot of belief.
What if this light bulb was the cure to racism, sexism, and classism? Hear me out. Do you know what people and light bulbs have in common? We both express as different colors, have different shapes, different sizes. We're manufactured in different places. Some of us are bright, some dim, some clear, and some broken. We appear to be very different on the outside. But the thing about these lights is there is one current running through each bulb. And in the same way, there is a singular energy running through each person on this planet. Doesn't matter what you look like, doesn't matter your race, gender, nationality, that's just the bulb. Inside of all that is who you really are. Energy. Don't believe your energy? Well, riddle me this. Say you have a friend named Jim, and you've been visiting Jim in the hospital until one day Jim unfortunately dies on the operating table. You say, oh no, Jim died. But his body is still there, his race, his gender. But you say Jim died because you know deep down that Jim was a lot more than his body. He was the intelligent energy that gave life to his body. Energy is what we are. And energy has no color. It is not Republican nor Democrat, white or black. Energy is not Christian, Muslim, or atheist. Energy is. We are intelligent, creative, universal energy. And if we understood that, then we would finally know what wise men and women have been trying to tell us since the dawn of time, that we are one.
So, and when you, obviously that can evoke all kinds of emotions and opportunities for us to recognize the power of what happens when we talk about energy flow as a part of what gives the life that we're trying to create into this boundary that we've created. And so what we're going to do is spend some time working through some of these things, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to break up into groups, and we're going to start asking ourselves some of these questions. But before we do it, each person's going to get a chance to start reflecting on this themselves. And so the first one, before we break out, is so how we can then begin to understand that deep why, that purpose. So when we get back to this idea of genius being our purpose, our passion, and the place we're putting all this to work. And right now, for the context here, we've got our purpose that we bring into this network. We've got the passions that we bring into this relationship within the Regenerative Communities Network. And this is the place, one of the places that we will put our genius and our passions to work. So let's get clearer on what those are as a part of our process. And understand this is a journey for all of us. We don't answer these questions and then immediately know what that is, but we do use these questions as a means to start that process. And some of you have been on that journey for your entire life. And some of you are beginning that journey as a part of this really deep connection to yourself and to these relationships. But with that being the case, we're going to pause, and I'm going to give you a chance to just start reflecting on these questions. And so grab out a piece of paper and a pen and just begin to write what comes to mind. And I'll guide you a little bit through this process. And then we're going to talk about it with one another. And I know that seems to be an intimate conversation, but what we'll get to do when we break into these groups is begin to communicate, because that's what life does. When we connect, life comes out of that. And if we can't share the things that are deeply meaningful to us, how then can we create life together? And I think that's got to be part of the beginning of this. So let's begin with, so what are you willing to struggle for? Right? Why are you even here today? And what about you being here today taps into the things that you care so deeply about that you want the world to change? And so what is it that you're willing to struggle for? And over the last 7 days, think about what are those moments that gave you great feelings of love or deep satisfaction? Well, where was the energy in the last 7 days? What was that experience for you? And now it's expanded over 7, but what about over the last month? When have you felt the most switched on? What were you doing? Maybe you were having a conversation with a sibling, or maybe it was an interaction with a child, or maybe it was just in deep meditation with the life around you. But what is it that switched you on, and who were you being in the moment? And is that different than what you typically are? Now, how about over the last 6 months? So when have you felt the most alive? And I use the word electrified, right? So where is this energy coming from? Maybe it was going on a trip and experiencing a different culture, experiencing life differently, hearing it from somebody else's perspective. Maybe it was sacrificing or deeply diving into something that you've never done before. But who were you being? What were you doing when all that was happening? And back to this number 1, we fall back into number 5, which is, so what is it you're willing to struggle for? So what are you going to do to lose yourself in something bigger than you? I think all of us know that what we're up to doing right now is bigger than all of us. And if we're going to create the conditions for life, we need one another. So how do we lose ourselves in that something larger? What does that look like? I'm going to give you a minute, total silence, to just think on those questions, and then we're going to break into groups. Okay, Alex, do your magic.
Feel like singing back in the time.
That was quick.
5 minutes goes very fast.
Yes, it does.
There's no time to muck around.
Unfortunately, the challenge is with a short time frame. So the next actually breakout will be a little longer, just to give you a little more time. So, yeah.
I think we've got everyone back, Trey.
Great. Well, we're going to do something unique here because typically webinars are tough to have multiple people talking all at once. But I do want to open it up to everybody to just say, does anybody have a reflection on just going through those questions and then just being able to communicate some of that? Some of you had a chance to communicate that to the small group of people that you're a part of. Anybody want to share?
I see Paul's hand. Go for it,
Anthony,
Paul.
too.
Yeah, I was talking with Joe and Galen and Pedro, and one of the things that actually came out of the presentation was a lot of the time the system encourages us to focus on what we do. And I did a little diagram here. It's often we focus on what we do, but really what's most important is how we be. A bit like the light bulb. How we be sends out the wattage. And Joe had an example of the work that he does and the way that he is sent a message to someone that actually came to join him in Costa Rica. And I realized that it's what we are, actually, that's the most important thing. And I think that's how the system helps, how the individual within the system can be part of humanizing the system as well as systemizing the human, because we do need to function within a structure. I'll finish there, but it's just a simple encapsulation.
Love it, Paul. Thank you. Beautiful. Somebody else?
I think Anthony Allen had raised his hand as well. Anthony?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Paul, I love your mustache, by the way. I just wanted to, I wanted to reflect. It was me and Felipe, and I mean, it goes so fast. Each one of those questions could be months long of conversation, but what always strikes me about this type of question and response is how each individual person has something different that lights them up, you know, and it's really remarkable how I think the tendency sometimes is to think, oh, what I'm really interested in is going to be what other people are really interested in, and what really gets people going. And that's not always the case, and that's a good thing. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Anthony. Anybody else? One other person to share. One last person. Somebody share.
Feel free to just unmute yourself because there's so many faces. I'm not sure I'll catch your hand.
I'll just say that in our group, I thought it was great. We had 4 different people and 4 different perspectives on what was needed to, move ahead in a sustainable, world from a variety of different angles. And I just thought that was so beautiful.
And a point about the process, I actually found time constraint useful because it forced me to sum it up in one sentence. So.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Great. Well, very good. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to jump back into this, and we are going to move to the next set of questions. This time, we're going to give you a little more time, 10 minutes. And but we're going to be asking, we're going to move from purpose, and now we're going to get to passion. And again, this is, as you have all said, This is more about beginning this conversation, and you could spend all day talking about some of these things. But what you need to do is start talking about these things with one another as we begin to form these intimate, dependent relationships within this boundary of our own making. And so, with that being the case, I want you to do the same thing we did before, but I want you to think back to those things that create this energy in you. Like, what did that 8-year-old self love doing? The joy of doing things for the fun of it. No rewards, no impressing anyone, just for yourself. What was that? And one of the things I like, which my wife reminds me often, is what makes you forget to eat when you're so immersed in an activity, or to use Paul's words, in being, that time passes without you realizing it. And some psychologists will call it flow, right? What is that? Where those passions align with what it is that you're participating in. And then this next question, so what can you do with unlimited energy? And we recognize a lot of times when that passion aligns with our genius, we begin to do things, and the source of that energy is unlimited. It's just like we can do it without ever feeling fatigued. What is that for you? And how do we as a network design around that, right? Versus designing around something that just zaps us of all our energy, right? And if you did not have a job, how would you choose to fill your day? So what would that look like in terms of just activities, or just continuing to be engaged in relationships? What would that look like? And then, in this kind of consumer sense, I threw it on here because sometimes people are like, oh, I just can't figure out how to land this tray. What do you mean specifically? Well, what's on your bucket list? What are those things that you would do because you're super passionate about it? And don't think of it in a traditional sense of just going to travel to see something, but maybe it's a deep impact or relationships that you invest more time and energy into. So just think through those. I'm going to give you another minute. We're going to break into the groups. There are going to be different groups this time around. So you get to meet new people as a part of this, and have a little more time to reflect on this. And then we're moving towards closing on this here in the next 20 minutes, but this will just continue as we move forward. Great. Welcome back, everybody. We have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to finish the rest of the presentation, and then we're just going to open it up to questions or comments so that you all have the opportunity to share or discuss things collectively. And I know that there are already structures in place to allow this conversation to move forward, but this will start that conversation with both Joe and Stuart and others here who are facilitating that process. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we will get back into the conversation. So with us addressing the passion, the last thing we were going to discuss is place. And what I call here in reference to energy flow around place is purpose and passion in relationship. A lot of times I find that there's a lot of conversations around someone's, purpose and then that passion, but it's not rooted in place. It's not rooted in these relationships that allow us to be able to see that come to life in a real meaningful way. It's not just about us conceptualizing things. It's about us living it in this unique connection with others. And so here are some questions. And again, you guys will get this PowerPoint, but here are some questions for you to think about. We're not going to be able to spend much time on it today, but who do you connect with and why? And how do you build on that? Because sometimes there's these natural connections with people. And what is it that you can do to build on that? And what do you like to do with other people in terms of connection? Could be in terms of learning. It could be around experiences. It could be just in deep conversation. And if you could go anywhere in the world, where would it be? Sometimes I find that the ecosystems that we're a part of attract people of different personalities and different perspectives and different experiences. And how do you build on that so that your purpose and passion in relationship to that place, into relationship to those people, have an opportunity to come alive? What people or places inspire you? And then what is the energy you feel when you are with the right person or in the right place, all at the right time, right? So when we talk about energy flow as a part of this process within creating a regenerative network, it's really the collection of all these things, because there is this deep belief that you as an individual bring energy into this network, that the collective energy is because of the energy you bring into this network. And how then do we design around that energy, around that genius, around those passions and the place that you want to be be able to create the unlimited potential that exists? And so just like we showed the slide around the bare soil isn't what it really is. It is just the current conditions right now. So what can we do to create it into this regenerative, unlimited potential, unleashing the dormant potential that exists in all of us and our collective connections and relationships? So that's really what all of this is about, is to be able to design around that. And so as we've talked about, a lot of this is designed around principles, and we won't spend much time on this. It's beautiful stuff, that Regenerative Communities Network coming out of the Capital Institute around principles of regeneration. It's not specifically about any of these. There are multiple types of principles that you can design around, but we really do see these as core part of what we and how we encourage design. And then, as someone brought up earlier, the structures, we also see this as a part of a larger framework that we believe in. And so what you guys experienced today, we talked a little bit about the organizational or network context, and we dove deeply into, for this session, energy flow, the idea of thriving people or thriving members. But there's substantial more to the framework that we bring as a means to be able to support this regenerative process. And so I'm just going to end with this quote, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments. One of my favorite poets, and as he was writing a letter to a young poet, or letters to a young poet, he wrote this: "Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and do try to love the questions themselves, as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answer, which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. The point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer." Thanks for allowing nRhythm, me and Alex, to participate in doing this with you guys. Let's live into those questions. The questions we've started today, the questions that you have, and the questions that truly become impactful to the network that we're forming and the lives and the communities that we get to be a part of changing. So thank you, guys. So now we'll just open it up to Q&A.
You can feel free to just unmute yourself, or just because there's two sets of heads on my screen, so I might miss you. So, but feel free to share any thoughts, reflections, questions. I see Joe.
Yeah, I was really struck by that last line in the Rilke poem about you, without noticing, you live your way into the answer. For me, that really felt resonant with the pathway that we've had such a problem solution framing of the environmental ecological crisis. That when I realized the bioregional regeneration pathway for planetary health, that the answer already existed. And then I went back and read writings about it from the mid-1970s, from the early bioregional thinkers, that they described everything we are living into being as answers now. I was just so struck by how people were stating what needed to be done before I was even born, but it's shaped every part of my life and how I've lived those questions, where now there are millions of us materializing, manifesting into being the answer, the rebalancing and restoring of health to the planet. And just, I'm so struck by the fractal nature of that. It's just truly riveting. But I wanted to share that with the group.
Thanks, Joe.
Joe. See, Travis, you're unmuted. Travis, did you have anything to share?
No, nothing right now, actually. I mean, I guess where would I like to work? I'll just hold up. I had like good responses to the rest of the questions, but I actually don't have something that, so I'll just hold up right now. Thanks.
Okay, no worries. I also saw Alexis. Were you unmuted earlier wanting to speak up or?
Yes, hi. I don't know, I felt, as I said at the beginning, I fell in love with the regeneration, but I'm totally lost from the jungle in Costa Rica. How can I work with you guys from everywhere in the world? I do believe everybody has good stuff, but I don't know how to share it. I'm more lost actually with all this passion tree has given than 1 hour and a half before. And by the way, last week, we just launched the first green bomb from the first Regeneration Day. I do believe we can have hope for our future. What I know is what I do here in Costa Rica, coming from Brussels, is good. People are in love. It's part of art, culture, biodiversity, more insect, more nature, more. How can we share that? How can we work together? How can we go further? I do believe Capital Institute is part of the earth of these networks. I do believe John and Stuart are like amazing guys, but you need to connect us with more webinar. It's just not a platform like me, Alex, I'm from Natural Pact and I'm just writing what I'm doing. I don't have time actually to be part of a lot of connection, but I would love to learn more about other projects. I was speaking with Kate from England, another Ana Margarita from Portugal. And we didn't have time to explain what we are doing because your question tree was so amazing question, good question, but I didn't explain what I was doing. And so I feel totally lost, actually. It's a lot of good energy, but I'm feeling lost. Thank you.
Can I actually respond now? Okay, so I'll just talk about like where I would like to work currently what I'm working on. So basically I'm organizing or working to develop replicable regional food systems at kind of a metropolitan, rural, urban county scale, about 5 to 6 to 10 counties surrounding a metropolitan area. And that's being organized at kind of an ecological system level, at like the Great Lakes level, as well as focusing on like the Mississippi drainage basin as well. But I very much would like to replicate this across equatorial Africa and moving towards Northern Africa and possibly even into the Middle East to deal with issues of violence and regeneration that are needed, and ecological restoration, obviously, and economic development as kind of a way to enter into those networks, disrupt the current degenerative processes, and start to regenerate those peacefully and prosperously and cooperatively. So that's very much where I'm gearing towards. Again, it's a replicable model. And so as we kind of work across the Great Lakes, my real focus is like thinking towards getting towards Africa. So.
Thanks, Travis. Others, any other comments or perspectives from our time together that you would want to share or to communicate?
Paul raised his hand.
See Paul, yeah.
First of all, I just want to acknowledge that one of the conversations I had in the chat room was about the existential crisis that each of us go through. There's a transitional point, and I think the analogy of the light bulb is quite an interesting one, because when we switch on and we realize that our own death is actually the sum total of our work, there's something, regenerative practitioners seem to be on the other side of the capitalist conundrum, which focuses so much on what we control and how we manage the flow of value and capture of wealth. And I think there is something transformational about us as we become story. I understand, Alexis, the challenge of physically doing what we do and hearing people talk about words. But I actually think there's a tension and a beauty in surrendering. And I can't help but think of the pain and the trauma that so many indigenous cultures have been through as the world has stolen everything and extracted everything in the most degenerative human experiment and stolen their culture. And I can't help but wonder if we need to embrace their humility and suffering as part of what motivates us in what we do, how we be, and who we are. It's just a reflection. I think there's a real challenge. How do we connect to value and making money and living our daily existence in this connected, busy world where we need to have those realities? But there's something bigger and better and bolder. But I don't think there's a humility that I have to acknowledge, respect to Indigenous people, and it's a floating thought.
Thank you, Paul. We can hold that floating thought while we continue to leave from here. So we've got about 3 minutes left. Want to honor the time you guys committed to being here, and I just want to turn it back over to Joe. Joe, any closing thoughts? Do we have time for a couple of more comments or questions?
Could I, Trey, just
Sure.
This is gradually I'm new. I'm sorry, I lost 1 hour because my Google said I was in Mountain Time, but it looks like I was in Pacific Time. So anyway, I lost the first hour, but nice to meet all of you and at least here. And I'm really looking forward to your PowerPoint, Trey. Yeah, I come from part of the global South, indigenous peasant. I call it ecological ethnicities because not necessarily race or the blood. Your experience with the land, of the elements of the earth. So I have theorized this idea of ecological ethnicities. So in that sense, those of you who know Wendell Berry from Kentucky, for me, he is an ecological ethnicity, although he's an Irish white male, but doesn't matter because his practices are very much indigenous. His views are like my grandmother's from the Himalayas. So that's the kind of theoretical contribution I have made, that we might want to expand beyond colonial categories of race and blood to talk about land-based cultures and all that. So you can look at it's online in ResearchGate and academia, or just type in Google my name and ecological ethnicities. That might be one way to respect the regenerative practices of people, cultures, places, irrespective of race, blood.
Very good.
That's all I want to contribute today.
Thank you. Beautiful. Okay, Joe, we turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Pramod, for that. I think it's really important that we keep in mind that we're carrying the diversity of the earth, including the earth's diversity of human cultures. They are the precious seeds that we carry to the future in our regenerative work. I want to say thank you to Trey and to Alex at nRhythm for this webinar, which I found deeply stimulating and moving. And I want to just express the intention that Stuart and I have had for the Regenerative Communities Network to create this kind of learning exchange and community feeling. So I'm going to begin offering weekly, I might just call them learning opportunities because they'll take various forms. That'll be hosted through the HiveBright website. But this will include webinars by any members of the community. Just contact me if you'd like to host one, or to have some kind of structured, facilitated dialogue using text or video. We can explore that together and begin to really inquire into what the different groups are needing. Like I saw the question in the chat box from Claire a moment ago about how we can mentor each other. I think mentorship is exactly the right framing. Mentorship is going to be so important in all directions from the tremendous knowledge and experience in our networks. So, so look for more of this to come in the near future. We'll start rolling it out onto the website and just being in contact with all of you, but also as you answer these questions for yourselves about energy flow, genius, and passion, how you feel you should show up, how you feel called to show up, please call me and let me help you bring your genius to the network. So that's my invitation back to you from this. It's to say, let's pull your energy into the light for others to see, and together we'll all be brighter for it. So thank you again, Trey and Alex, and onward we go from here.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Joe and everyone. Nice to meet you all. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.